Welcome. You're listening to the Malcontent News Russia-Ukraine War podcast, the show that cuts through the fog of war and updates you about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts.
Hello, I'm Marina Yevshan, your host of the Russia-Ukraine War Report podcast, and today is July the 12th, 2024. It has been 3,819 days since Russia started covert military operations in Crimea, 10 years and 143 days since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, and 2 years 139 days since Russia expanded its war aggression. I had an unplanned matter during the first half of the week, and I thank you for your patience during our unexpected break. Today's podcast looks at events that happened on Thursday and Friday morning, and brings you up to speed on major events over the last week. During the podcast, you will find the Russia-Ukraine war map helpful to visualize the areas discussed. The Russia-Ukraine War Report is compiled by our team from around the world. Today's report includes information from our direct contacts and journalists in Ukraine, the Russian Ministry of Defense, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine morning reports, operational commands north, south and east of Ukraine, open source intelligence, our in-house team of analysts and geospatial experts, and pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian mail bloggers on social media channels with a track record of trying to be accurate. We have one mission, the truth, because the truth matters. Here is my daily assessment. 1. In our assessment, Russian losses of armor, mobility and personnel over the last 120 days are unsustainable, even for Moscow, with clear indications that Russian combat potential is declining. 2. We also assess that the NATO alliance's policy of escalation management is a failure and is directly responsible for the Russian plot to assassinate Armin Paperger, the CEO of German defense company Rheinmetall. Further, this incident aligns with our previous assessment that Russia is setting conditions to commit further acts of aggression in Europe. 3. Doubts about the competency of United States President Joe Biden and the threats to leave NATO and end support to Ukraine by presumptive Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump are a direct threat to global security and Ukraine's military capabilities in 2025 and beyond. 4. Russia will continue to commit increasingly worse violations of international humanitarian law until international watchdogs and Ukraine's allies take a unified and firm stance. 5. We maintain that the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine must hold Ukrainian field commanders who make critical mistakes accountable for their errors. 6. Multiple analysts and NATO leaders agreed with our earlier assessment that Russia will continue to make tactical gains during its current offensive, but the lack of strategy, low troop morale, poor battlefield medicine, corruption and logistics issues make it highly unlikely that Russian forces will be able to exploit any new breaches in 2024. 7. We maintain the world is caught in the mutually assured destruction and stability paradox. 8. Russia's sustained attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which has destroyed over 80% of its combined thermal and power plant capacity, is a continuation of Russian crimes against humanity that started in October 2022, as outlined in 4 arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court. 9. The attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure have incrementally increased the chance of an intentional nuclear accident at multiple nuclear facilities in Ukraine. Over the last 24 hours, Russian attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure killed at least 7 and wounded 45. Yesterday, Russia launched at least 11 Shahed-136 one-way drones and 5 Kh-101 cruise missiles from Tu-95 strategic bombers near the Caspian Sea. All 5 missiles and 11 drones were intercepted. Russia may have launched an additional 8 Shaheds, with the Ukrainian Air Force reporting that the, quote, 8 drones were lost in location. Presumably, in order to overload air defense, the enemy uses simulators of attack UAVs. In the Kharkiv Oblast, the VKS, that's the Russian Aerospace Forces, bombed the settlement of Bily Kolodязь with a Fab-500, killing 3 civilians and wounding 9. Northeast of Izum, the VKS attacked Borova with a Fab-1500 MPK glide bomb, damaging 12 homes and wounding 4 civilians aged 30 to 70. Russian barrel and tubed artillery strikes and bombings by the VKS killed 4 and wounded 21 across the Donetsk Oblast. The worst incident was in Mirnograd, where a rocket struck an apartment building, killing a 15-year-old and wounding 12, including 2 children. In the city of Kherson, Russian forces shelled the residential area of the Dnipro district, sparking fires. During the emergency response, first responders were attacked by one-way drones, wounding a firefighter, a civilian and a photographer with the Kherson regional government. 2 war crimes in one wasn't enough, with the Russian one-way drone attacking a humanitarian aid distribution point in Stanislav, another violation of international humanitarian law, wounding 2 women aged 40 and 45. Additional attacks by Russian forces wounded 2 more civilians. Nikopol in the Dnipropetrovsk region was attacked by heavy artillery and one-way drones, wounding 2 civilians. And in the Sumy Oblast, Russian forces attacked the Seredina Buda Hromada with artillery rounds and one-way drones, wounding 2 civilians. Here is today's action report summary. Let's get you back up to speed. Over the last week, the number of daily Russian assaults has been declining since the July 1st peak of 189 attacks. On Wednesday, Russian forces carried out 120 assaults, the smallest number since June 15th. Through yesterday, the 7-day moving average dropped to 141, falling further below the linear trend line and reaching the lowest level since June 21st. The second phase of the Russian summer offensive has ended in 25th day, and it is unclear if the last 7 days are a signal that another reset of operational goals is on the horizon, or if this is an operational pause. However, the 7-day moving average dropping below the linear trend line is a signal that the Russian offensive has reached its peak. There were Russian and Ukrainian advances over the last week, but no major changes to the line of conflict since we last talked. Today's analysis discusses tanks and how Russia's reserve is approaching a tipping point. Analyst Yakub Yanovsky, who maintains the Oryx database, noted that Russia has lost 100 T-90M main battle tanks, the best combat operational tank in Russia's inventory since the expansion of its war of aggression against Ukraine. Analyst Richard Varaka noted that the T-90A, which Russia fielded during the spring of 2022, has disappeared from the battlefield. He also highlighted that since the start of 2024, the T-90S, an export version of the T-90 designed for India, Algeria and Vietnam, has reappeared, and the percentage of losses is increasing. The Russian Ministry of Defense admitted that the export version of the T-90 is being used in Ukraine, confirming that the Russian military has diverted committed foreign orders in an attempt to backfill their losses. Data also shows that Russia is becoming increasingly dependent on the T-62 tank, which we classify as medium-duty due to its weight, armor thickness and caliber of the main gun. Since re-entering service with the Russian Federation Armed Forces in July 2022, 161 have been lost, which is 10 more than all documented T-90 losses. Based on the analysis of Varaka and Twitter, also known as X, user HighMost, we believe that Russia's production and restoration of tanks has reached its peak and will start to decline by winter. Russia is only producing new T-90s, and it remains unclear if new hulls are being forged. Fundamentally, a T-90 is a highly modified T-72, and they share the same hull. All other variants, the T-54, T-55, T-62, T-72 and T-80, are coming from Cold War reserves for refurbishment. The T-80 and its variants, which were the backbone of Russian armed forces before 2022, have become an endangered species. Another issue that will further limit Russia's tank production by 2025 is the inability to produce new barrels, while providing sustainment for equipment already in the field. As Russia dives deeper into its reserves, Moscow will further under-equip military units to extend their total supply. Field commanders will increasingly turn to improvised solutions. This is already occurring for armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, with Russian forces increasingly dependent on ATVs, motorcycles, and turtle tanks. We also maintain our early assessment based on the research by Verica that Russia has exhausted its supply of pontoon bridge segments, tugs, and bridge-laying systems. Russian troops remain stuck in at least 3 locations where historically bridging attempts would have been made by this point. Additionally, Russia has likely lost many of its experienced combat engineers, further diminishing its ability to execute wet crossings. There is more analysis about Russia's losses, and the table of Russian versus Ukrainian heavy equipment losses using information from the Oryx database has been updated. There's a link in the podcast description to our daily situation report. Now, let's talk about what happened on the battlefield. Ready? Here we go. Starting in the Kharkiv Oblast, we begin in the Liptsi-Vovchansk area of operation, or EO. Fighting continued in Vovchansk, where Ukrainian forces remained on the offensive. Russian troops are still surrounded at the machine aggregate plant, and since my last podcast, the northeastern part of Vovchansk has been cleared of Russian troops. In Hlyboke, Ukrainian troops made additional advances, reaching the last farms on the northern edge of the village. Last weekend, Robert Brovdi and his Birds of Magyar shifted their focus to the Russian ground lines of communication, that's supply lines, in the direction of Liptsi. After establishing fire control, Russian troops became cut off, and Ukrainian troops now control most of the village. In the Kupiansk EO, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, or GSAFU, reported that defensive lines had been stabilized. A position shared by our team and military analyst Michael Kaufman. Fighting continued in the areas of Sinkivka, Vilshana, and Berestove. One thing you missed over the last week was a Russian advance to the eastern edge of Pischane. Fighting has stopped in the Svatovo EO of the Luhansk Oblast, with no significant activity reported by any source in 3 days. In the Kremenna EO, Russian attacks in the direction of Makiivka and Nevske were unsuccessful. Fighting has also sharply declined in this region. Let's talk about the Donbass and the northeastern part of the Donetsk Oblast. In the Siversk EO, Russian forces continued their attempts to advance toward Bilogorivka from the east, Verkhnyokamyansk from Zolotarivka, and Vyimka from the southeast. Russian troops also attacked Ukrainian positions in the area of Rozdolivka. In the Konstantinivka EO, my last update was Ukrainian forces withdrawing from the Canal district. During the week, Ukrainian troops who were surrounded for 70 days and supported by drone deliveries staged a breakout, aided by new Ukrainian penal soldiers. Area military commanders reported that the forested belts north and south of the Canal district are not under the control of Russian forces. You might remember I told you last week that the bridges across the Siversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal hadn't been destroyed. Now we know why. Fighting continued on the western edge of the Canal district of Chasiv Yar and in the forested belts to the north and east of the canal near Ivanivska. Russia also continued its attempts to restore lost positions in the area of Klishchiivka without success. Heavy fighting continued in the Toretsk-New York EO and west of Avdiivka. Over half of all Russian assaults were in these regions. There were no claims of new Russian advances over the last 24 hours. Heavy fighting continued on the eastern edge of Toretsk and in Zalizne and Pivdenne. GSAFU reported that Russian attempts to advance deeper into New York were repulsed, while Russian sources claim there were new advances. We maintain the situation in New York remains critical. The situation is also very difficult in the southwestern part of the Donetsk Oblast. In the Avdiivka AO, Russian assaults near Kalinove, Novoalexandrivka, Progress, Vozdvizhenka, Sokil, and the direction of Novoselivka Persha continued. Video showed that Russian forces raised 2 flags in Voskhod, confirming the village was captured. Russian sources claimed that Yevgenivka was captured, but the proof was 2 soldiers in a blurry, tightly framed video against a brick wall, making geolocation impossible. Without visual evidence, we maintain that the village is contested. On the banks of the Vovcha River, fighting continued in the eastern part of Karlivka. In occupied Donetsk Oblast, there was a tale of a Russian Tor-2 air defense system in 3 acts. We link to the video that shows this summer blockbuster. Act 1 has a Ukrainian drone spotting the Tor-2 near occupied Zuyivka. Act 2 contained plenty of drama, as Russian air defense attempts to shoot down the drone, but misses. The final act was the best, with the Tor-2 repositioning near occupied Zachativka and destroyed by a drone-directed rocket launched by HIMARS. In the Vuhledar AO, Russian forces made additional advances in the eastern part of Krasnogorivka early in the week, with fighting reaching the hospital. However, there is no indication that Russian forces have established military control. Yesterday, fighting continued near Georgievka on the western edge of Paraskoviivka, the outskirts of Kostiantinivka, and between Vodyane and Solotka. To the southwest in the Vremivka AO, Russian forces carried out 4 attacks in different areas near Urozhaine without success. There is nothing to update along the line of conflict in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, where fighting has been scattered and positional. The International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, provided an update on the status of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, also known as ZNPP. On Tuesday, inspectors were successfully rotated. Director General Rafael Grossi reported that the adjacent town of Enerhodar was experiencing power outages, water shortages, and smoke from nearby forest fires due to reported, quote, military activities in the area. The outages have not impacted operations at ZNPP. Grossi again expressed concern about fighting in the area of the plant, which has continued since Russia occupied the facility in March 2022. Quote, continued military activity in the region remains a serious concern, and it is essential that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is protected to ensure nuclear safety and security. Grossi expressed concern beyond the NPP, stating that the widespread power and water outages are impacting all nuclear power plant workers and affecting their performance. On-site inspectors told Grossi they continue to hear explosions and gunfire at, quote, various distances from the plant on a near-daily basis. Last week, the IAEA team checked the status of the 20 on-site emergency diesel generators and their fuel supply and found that everything was within established safety requirements. In New York, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a Ukrainian-initiated resolution with 49 co-sponsors from 6 continents for the demilitarization and withdrawal of Russian occupiers from ZNPP, quote, in light of Russia's failure to comply with IAEA governing bodies' resolutions. The measure passed with 99 votes in favor, 9 against, and 60 abstentions. Before the vote, Deputy Russian UN Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky told the General Assembly the resolution was meant, quote, to try to promote the false Western narrative about the source of threats to nuclear facilities in Ukraine. Belarus, Burundi, Cuba, Eritrea, Mali, Nicaragua, North Korea, Syria, and the Russian Federation voted against the measure. Notable abstentions included Armenia, Iran, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Vietnam, and the 4 other core BRICS nations of Brazil, India, China, and South Africa.
You're listening to the Malcontent News Russia-Ukraine War podcast. Our team of journalists, researchers, and analysts is funded by readers, listeners, and viewers just like you. To support independent journalism, please consider becoming a patron. You can find us on patreon.com@malcontentnews.
Here is my theater-wide update. On the last day of the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., Ukraine, the US, Canada, the United Kingdom, 19 European Union nations, the European Union, and Japan signed the Ukrainian Compact, an agreement for continued security support for Ukraine through the 2030s. The Compact pledges to, quote, support Ukraine's immediate defense and security needs, unquote, create a roadmap within the next 6 months on how to build Ukraine's future force for self-defense and deterrence through 2027, and at the end of hostilities, determine what steps will be taken if Russia attacks Ukraine again, including, quote, the provision of swift and sustained security assistance and the imposition of economic and other costs on Russia. During the Ukraine Compact announcement, US President Joe Biden initially introduced the President of Ukraine as President Putin.
And now I want to hand it over to the President of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. He's going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it. Anyway.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that, quote, "Attackams, scalps and storm shadows would be even more effective if we could hit Russian military airfields from which planes carrying the glided bombs take off." During a later press conference at the summit, Biden stated that Ukraine has to be responsible for its own air defense and clarified that all F-16s with the Ukrainian Air Force would be based within Ukraine. Biden stated that Ukrainian strikes on Moscow would be, quote, useless. Eastern European leaders and Ukrainian commentators expressed bewilderment and frustration at Biden's position, openly questioning why Russian attacks on children's hospitals are acceptable, while Ukrainian strikes on the Russian military airfields launching the attacks are not allowed. Before you write angry emails and podcast reviews, keep listening. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said comments he made yesterday about Ukraine using storm shadows to attack anywhere within Russia were taken out of context, and no such permission was given. He clarified that London's policy had not changed, and Ukraine could only attack Russian sites within the occupied territories. Outgoing NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said that Ukraine has a fundamental right to self-defense, and NATO is obligated to help. Quote, "The only way to hit military targets, missile launches, or airfields that conduct attacks against Ukraine is to destroy military facilities on Russian territory." Romania became the 23rd partner to sign a security agreement with Ukraine. The 10-year bilateral agreement specifically addresses cooperation in defending the Black Sea, mine clearing, and the training of Ukrainian pilots to fly the F-16. The United States announced a new $225 million military aid package for Ukraine using Presidential Drawdown Authority. The full list is in our situation report, but the most critical item was a single Patriot air defense battery. In a separate statement, UK PM Starmer announced that the International Fund for Ukraine, supported by Norway, had signed a $387 million agreement to purchase 120,000 newly made Russian Standard 152mm artillery rounds for Ukraine. The country of origin and delivery date were not shared. Norway also announced it was allocating $94 million in monetary aid to bolster Ukraine's air defenses in support of the German Air Defense Initiative. The Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister of Australia, Richard Marles, announced that his nation was preparing to provide Ukraine with $250 million in military support, the largest single package the country has provided. Australia plans to send air defense missiles and systems, anti-tank-guided missiles and ammunition. The Prime Minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen, called for her nation to transfer all air defense assets to Ukraine. "We decided many months ago to give all our artillery to Ukraine. Why? Because it will be applied better in Ukraine than in Denmark. And now we must do the same with air defense. We have a section in our situation report called European Threat that we normally don't cover in the podcast, but there have been major events in the last 24 hours. United States news agency CNN reported that US and German intelligence foiled an April 2024 plot by Russia to assassinate the CEO of Rheinmetall, Armin Paperger. The Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, Annalena Baerbock, told CNN, quote, "In view of the latest reports on Rheinmetall, this is what we have actually been communicating more and more clearly in recent months. Russia is waging a hybrid war of aggression with sabotage, with cyber attacks, with the paralysis of GPS so that Baltic aircraft can no longer land in neighboring countries. We have seen that there have been attacks on people on European territory. We have seen that there have been attacks on factories. And this emphasizes once again that we as Europeans must protect ourselves as best we can and not be naive." The Ministry of Foreign Affairs would not confirm the CNN report, only stating that Germany takes all threats seriously. The Deputy Defense Minister of Poland, Paweł Bejda, announced that starting on August 1st, the number of troops on the Belarus frontier will increase to 17,000, with 8,000 service directly on the border. The announcement comes 2 days after China and Belarus started joint military exercises less than 25 kilometers from the Polish border. The dog potato prince and illegitimate president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, said that the nations would practice airborne assaults, river crossings, and urban warfare. China described their exercises as joint counter-terrorism training. Airborne assaults and contested river crossings are not defensive actions. I'm just saying. The Minister of European Affairs of the government of Sweden, Jessica Roswall, announced that France, Sweden, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland and Finland will boycott all meetings of the Council of the European Union during Prime Minister Viktor Orban's tenure as the rotating president. Quote, "Hungary's actions during the presidency are harmful and must have consequences. Therefore, Sweden will not participate at the political level in the informal government meetings in July. The boycotting nations will send civil servants to meetings of the Council of the EU as observers. Reportedly, other nations are discussing taking similar measures." Orban just completed a July 5th state visit with autocrat Vladimir Putin in Moscow.
How is it to shake hands with Vladimir Putin, who, for my opinion, is a war criminal, and not only my opinion, but also others, and at the same time, somebody who is appreciating Stalin?
Okay. So first of all, we have to understand that what is decided by the war is not who is right and who is bad. It's not about who is right, who has no right. Because each party has always own argument why it is reasonable to go into war.
And then, on July the 8th, made an unannounced state visit to Beijing, where he met with President Xi Jinping.
There are 5 main actors in this very complicated situation. And now I have met 2 out of the 5. Ukrainians, Russians, then United States, then China, then European Union.
Traveling to the United States, Orban did not attend the NATO summit, instead visiting with former president and presumptive Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago in Florida.
Have you talked to Donald Trump lately? Because Trump is
That's
talking.
a very important step. His son was here just 2 weeks ago.
On Twitter, Orban called his trip, quote, "Peace Mission 5.0. Russian state media agency Izvestia called the visit, quote, "futile," and suggested that Orban could pass information gathered from Ukraine, Russia and China to Trump and his team. On Russia One, propagandist Olga Skabeyeva called Orban, quote, Trump's foreign minister, who was shuttling information from Putin, while others suggested Orban was carrying a gift to Trump from the Russian autocrat. The EU legal service told member states that Orban's actions had violated the bloc's treaties that forbid any, quote, measure which could jeopardize the attainment of the Union's objectives. European Council President Charles Michel told the UK news agency The Financial Times, quote, This was a political mistake to go to Moscow. In 10 years, I have never seen such a severe reaction from 26 other countries to the actions of one. And that's what we know. Yes, I know, it's the weekend already. I will be back on Monday, promise. Your support of my home, Ukraine, helps us make history and protect the future for all.
You've been listening to the Malcontent News Russia-Ukraine War podcast. To help keep us independent, please consider providing financial support by becoming a patron. Want on-demand news in your hand? Download the Google News app and make Malcontent News one of your favorites to receive breaking news updates. Thank you for listening.